The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of Murphy's General Store, dust rising in amber clouds that caught the late afternoon sun. Margaret Ashford stepped down carefully, her gloved hands steadying her against the wooden step. The driver tossed her single carpet bag to the ground with little ceremony, then climbed back to his seat without meeting her eyes. "This is Willow Creek, miss," he said, his voice flat. "End of the line." Margaret nodded, smoothing her dark wool traveling dress. She had expected more, perhaps a welcome, certainly recognition. The letter from Thomas Whitmore had been clear: come to Willow Creek, marry him, help him run his mercantile business. She had written back immediately, accepting his proposal with the careful penmanship of a woman who had once taught school before scandal had stripped that privilege away. The store's bell chimed as she pushed open the door. Inside, shelves lined with goods cast long shadows in the dim light. A portly man with thinning hair looked up from behind the counter, his expression shifting from polite interest to something colder. "You must be Thomas Whitmore," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Ashford. I believe you're expecting me." His face paled. "You're the woman from the letters?" "I am." She kept her voice steady, though something in his tone made her stomach clench. "I've come as we discussed." Thomas glanced around the store, then back at her. "I'm sorry, miss, but there's been a mistake. A misunderstanding." He fidgeted with the pencil behind his ear. "You see, I was expecting someone different." Margaret felt the familiar sting of rejection, sharp and immediate. She had described herself honestly in her letters: a woman of 26, skilled in domestic arts, of good character despite her circumstances. What she had not mentioned was the faint scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, the permanent reminder of the night her reputation had been destroyed along with her former life. "I see," she said quietly. "And what sort of woman were you expecting, Mr. Whitmore?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Someone younger, perhaps. More suitable for a man in my position." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret had heard variations of this conversation before, though never after traveling 300 miles on the promise of a new beginning. She lifted her chin, calling upon the dignity that had sustained her through worse humiliations. "I understand completely," she said. "Good day, Mr. Whitmore." She turned and walked back into the street, her carpet bag heavy in her hand. The sun was setting, painting the dusty main street in shades of gold and rust. A few townspeople had gathered on the wooden sidewalk, their curious glances following her movement. By morning, everyone would know about the woman who had come to marry Thomas Whitmore and been turned away. Margaret walked until she found herself at the edge of town, where a small boarding house sat beneath a grove of cottonwood trees. The sign in the window read "Rooms Available," and she climbed the front steps with the last of her courage. Mrs. Adelaide Hutchins, the proprietress, was a woman of perhaps 60 with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. She looked Margaret up and down with frank assessment. "You're the woman who came for Thomas Whitmore," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am. Though it seems that arrangement is no longer suitable." Mrs. Hutchins nodded. "Thomas is a fool, but that's neither here nor there. I have a room available. $2 a week, meals included." Margaret counted the bills in her purse. She had enough for perhaps a month, maybe 2 if she was careful. "I'll take it." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand beneath a window that looked out toward the mountains. Margaret set her carpet bag on the floor and sank onto the bed, allowing herself a moment of private despair. She had left everything behind in Kansas: her sister's disapproving household, the whispered rumors that followed her everywhere, the constant reminder of the night that had changed everything. Now she was alone again, in a place where no one knew her story but where the rejection felt just as sharp. That night, she lay awake listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods and made a decision. She would not return to Kansas. She would not write to her sister asking for help. Whatever happened, she would build a life here, even if she had to do it thread by thread. The next morning, Margaret walked into town with a proposition. She had noticed the general store's window display shirts with missing buttons, torn work pants, a hand-lettered sign that read "Mending Needed." She pushed open the door and found not Thomas Whitmore, but a younger man with dark hair and careful eyes. "I'm looking for work," she said simply. "I can sew, mend, and do fine needlework." The man looked up from the ledger he was writing in. "I'm Jacob Morrison. I manage the store's accounts and orders." His voice was quiet, thoughtful. "Thomas mentioned you might be looking for employment, did he?" Margaret's tone was dry. And what else did he mention? Jacob's expression remained neutral. That you're skilled with a needle and thread. That's all I need to know. Something in his matter-of-fact tone eased the tension in Margaret's shoulders. I can start immediately. The mending pays 25 cents per item, depending on complexity. There's a sewing room in the back. He gestured toward a doorway she hadn't noticed. Mrs. Patterson used to do the work, but she moved to Denver last month. Margaret followed him to a small room lined with shelves of fabric and thread. A sewing machine sat by the window, and baskets of mending waited on a work table. Sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. This will do nicely, she said. Jacob nodded. I'll leave you to it then. As he turned to go, Margaret spoke again. Mr. Morrison? Thank you. He paused. For what? For not asking questions I don't want to answer. Their eyes met for a moment, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or simply the recognition of two people who had learned to value privacy. We all have our stories, Miss Ashford, he said quietly. Most of them are none of anybody else's business. Margaret spent the morning sorting through the mending. Work pants worn thin at the knees, shirts with tears from fence wire, a child's dress that needed letting out. Each piece told a story of hard work and careful economy. She set up her workspace methodically, organizing thread by color, testing the tension on the sewing machine. By afternoon, she had finished 3 items and started on a 4th. The work was soothing, familiar. The rhythm of the needle through fabric, the satisfaction of making something whole again, these were comforts she had carried with her from her old life. Jacob appeared in the doorway around closing time, his ledger under his arm. How did it go? He asked. Well enough. Margaret held up a shirt she had just finished, the torn sleeve now perfectly mended. I should have the current pile finished by the end of the week. He examined her work with the careful attention of someone who understood quality. This is fine stitching, better than Mrs. Patterson's, if I'm honest. I had a good teacher. Margaret didn't elaborate, and Jacob didn't ask. As the days passed, Margaret established a routine. She would arrive at the store each morning, work in the sewing room until late afternoon, then return to her boarding house for dinner with Mrs. Hutchins. The townspeople gradually grew accustomed to her presence, though she felt their curious glances whenever she walked down the main street. She learned things about Jacob Morrison in small increments. He had come to Willow Creek from back east, though he never mentioned why. He was educated, she could tell by the way he spoke and the books he sometimes carried. He was kind to the children who came into the store, patient with the elderly customers who counted out their money in pennies. He was also, she realized, quietly handsome in a way that had nothing to do with conventional features and everything to do with the steadiness in his eyes. One morning, she found a cup of coffee waiting on her work table, still steaming. When she thanked him, Jacob simply nodded and returned to his ledgers. The gesture was small, but in her world of careful economies and measured kindness, it felt significant. The coffee became a daily ritual. Sometimes Jacob would linger in the doorway, ostensibly checking on her progress, but really, Margaret suspected, enjoying the quiet companionship. They spoke little, but the silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward. It was during one of these quiet moments that Margaret made her decision. She had been working on a particularly challenging repair, a wedding dress that had been damaged in a fire. The smoke stains were impossible to remove, but the lace could be saved, repurposed into something new. She had been experimenting with a design, creating a delicate collar that could be worn with a simple dress. The pattern was intricate, requiring hours of careful work, but the result was beautiful, something that transformed the ordinary into the elegant. When Jacob appeared for his usual afternoon check, she held up the collar. What do you think? She asked. He examined it carefully, holding it up to the light. It's beautiful. You made this? From the salvaged lace. I thought perhaps. She hesitated, then plunged ahead. I thought perhaps other women in town might be interested in similar pieces, something to make their everyday dresses more special. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. You're thinking of taking orders? If there's interest. Margaret tried to keep her voice casual, but this felt like a risk, a step towards something more permanent. I could make collars, cuffs, perhaps decorative panels. Nothing too elaborate, but, she trailed off, suddenly uncertain, but beautiful. Jacob finished. Yes, I think there would be interest. That evening, Margaret showed the collar to Mrs. Hutchins, who examined it with the eye of a woman who had spent 60 years appreciating fine craftsmanship. "This is exquisite, dear," she said. "Where did you learn to do work like this?" "My grandmother," Margaret said. "She was a seamstress in Philadelphia. She taught me that even the simplest things could be made beautiful with enough care." Mrs. Hutchins nodded thoughtfully. "I'll mention it to the ladies at church on Sunday. Word will spread." By the following week, Margaret had her first order, a set of cuffs for Mrs. Miller, the banker's wife. Then came a request for a collar from Sarah Evans, who worked at the hotel. Each piece was different, designed to complement the wearer's existing wardrobe and personality. The work was more challenging than simple mending, but also more rewarding. Margaret found herself looking forward to each new project, each opportunity to create something beautiful from ordinary materials. Jacob began stopping by more frequently, ostensibly to check on her progress, but really, Margaret knew, to see her work. He never offered empty compliments, but his quiet attention felt like approval. One afternoon, as she worked on a particularly intricate collar, he surprised her with a question. "What brought you to Willow Creek, Miss Ashford?" Margaret's hands stilled on the lace. It was the first personal question he had asked, and she wasn't sure how to answer. The truth was complicated, painful, and not something she had shared with anyone since leaving Kansas. "I was looking for a fresh start," she said finally. "And have you found it?" She looked around the sewing room, at the baskets of mending and the partially completed collar in her hands. Through the window, she could see the main street of Willow Creek, dusty and unprepossessing, but somehow becoming familiar. "I think perhaps I have," she said. Jacob nodded. "I'm glad." The simplicity of his response, the genuine warmth in his voice, made something flutter in Margaret's chest. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the quiet comfort of working while he managed the store's business. Now she realized that what she felt was more than mere comfort. As autumn approached, Margaret's reputation as a skilled seamstress spread beyond Willow Creek. Women from neighboring towns began placing orders, and she found herself working longer hours to keep up with demand. The additional income allowed her to move from Mrs. Hutchins' boarding house to a small cottage at the edge of town. The cottage was modest to rooms and a kitchen, but it was hers. She set up her sewing machine in the front room, where the morning light was best, and arranged her threads and fabrics with the satisfaction of someone creating a permanent home. Jacob helped her move her few possessions, carrying her sewing machine with the careful attention of someone who understood its value. When everything was arranged, he stood in the doorway looking around the small space. "It suits you," he said. "Thank you." Margaret smoothed her skirts, suddenly nervous. "Would you like some coffee? I have a pot on the stove." They sat at her small kitchen table, drinking coffee and talking about inconsequential things: the weather, the new merchandise arriving at the store, the upcoming harvest festival. But beneath the ordinary conversation, Margaret sensed something else, a current of feeling that neither of them had acknowledged. When Jacob rose to leave, he paused at the door. "Margaret," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I want you to know that I'm glad you came to Willow Creek. Whatever brought you here, I'm grateful for it." After he left, Margaret sat in her empty cottage thinking about his words. She had come to Willow Creek expecting to marry Thomas Whitmore, and instead had found something she hadn't even known. She was looking for a place where she could be herself, where her past didn't define her future. The harvest festival arrived, with the first frost, transforming the town square into a carnival of booths and displays. Margaret set up a small table with samples of her work, nervous about displaying her creations so publicly. She had made several pieces specifically for the festival: a delicate shawl worked in cream-colored wool, a set of lace cuffs that could transform any plain dress. Women stopped to admire her work, running their fingers over the intricate stitching. Orders came steadily throughout the day, and Margaret found herself taking measurements and discussing designs with an enthusiasm that surprised her. Jacob appeared at her booth in the late afternoon, carrying 2 cups of cider. "How's business?" he asked, handing her a cup. "Better than I expected." Margaret gestured to her order book, now filled with requests. "I may need to hire help if this continues." "That's wonderful." Jacob's smile was warm, genuine. "You've found your place here." "I have." Margaret looked around the festival, at the families enjoying the autumn evening, at the familiar faces of townspeople who now nodded to her in greeting. "I never expected it to feel like home so quickly. Sometimes the best things happen when we're not looking for them." Jacob said quietly. Their eyes met, and Margaret felt that flutter again, stronger this time. She had been so focused on building her business, on creating a life for herself, that she had barely acknowledged the growing feelings between them. But now, standing in the golden light of the festival, she couldn't ignore them any longer. Jacob, she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. I know, he said softly. I feel it too. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Margaret had spent so long protecting herself, building walls around her heart, that this moment of vulnerability felt both terrifying and liberating. I should tell you, she said, about why I left Kansas, about what happened. Jacob shook his head. Only if you want to. Your past is your own, Margaret. What matters to me is who you are now. The kindness in his voice, the absolute acceptance, made tears prick at Margaret's eyes. She had spent 3 years believing that her past would always define her, that she would always be the woman who had been ruined by scandal. Jacob's words offered a different possibility, that she could be simply herself, without explanation or apology. Thank you, she whispered. As the festival wound down, Jacob walked her home through the quiet streets. At her front door, he paused. Margaret, I'd like to court you properly, if you'll have me. The formal words, spoken in his careful voice, made Margaret smile. I'd like that very much. He reached for her hand, lifting it to his lips for a gentle kiss. Then I'll call on you Sunday afternoon, if that's agreeable. It's more than agreeable, Margaret said. Winter came early that year, blanketing Willow Creek in snow that transformed the harsh landscape into something beautiful and clean. Margaret's cottage became a haven of warmth and productivity. Her sewing room filled with the intricate pieces that had become her signature. Jacob's courtship was as careful and thoughtful as everything else about him. He brought her books from his personal collection, appeared at her door with firewood when the temperatures dropped, spent long evenings talking by her fireplace about everything and nothing. They were an unlikely pair, the educated man from back east and the woman with the mysterious past, but their connection deepened with each passing day. Jacob never pressed for details about her life before Willow Creek, accepting her occasional silences with the same patience he brought to everything else. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Margaret finally told him her story. They were sitting by the fire, Jacob reading aloud from a book of poetry while Margaret worked on a particularly delicate collar. The domestic scene felt so natural, so right, that she found herself wanting to share everything with him. I was engaged before, she said suddenly, interrupting his reading, in Kansas, to a man named Robert Caldwell. Jacob closed the book and waited. He was prominent in the community, a lawyer, well respected. I thought I was fortunate to have attracted his attention. Margaret's fingers continued their work, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm. I was teaching school then, living with my sister and her husband. Everything seemed perfect. She paused, remembering. Robert had a temper, though he hid it well in public. He was controlling, possessive, but I thought that was love, or at least what love was supposed to feel like. Jacob's expression remained neutral, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. The night it happened, we had argued. I had expressed an opinion about something, I can't even remember what, and he became angry. Violent. She touched the faint scar on her face unconsciously. He threw a glass at me, cut me with the broken pieces. The room was silent except for the crackling of the fire. I ended the engagement immediately, of course. But Robert, he spread rumors, said I had been inappropriate with other men, that I was unstable, dangerous. The school board dismissed me. My sister believed him, or pretended to. I became a pariah overnight. Margaret set down her sewing and looked at Jacob directly. That's what I am, Jacob. A ruined woman. Someone who couldn't make a proper marriage work, who brought scandal to her family. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the space between them and took her hand. That's not what you are, he said firmly. You're a woman who had the courage to leave a dangerous situation, who built a new life from nothing, who creates beautiful things with her hands and makes this town a better place by being in it. Jacob, no, let me finish. His grip on her hand tightened. You're kind to children, patient with difficult customers, generous with your time and skills. You've made a place for yourself here through hard work and determination. That's who you are, Margaret, not the lies one bitter man told about you. The absolute certainty in his voice broke something open in Margaret's chest. She had carried the weight of Robert's accusations for so long, had internalized them so completely, that she had forgotten there might be another way to see herself. I love you, Jacob said simply. I love your strength and your gentleness and your quiet dignity. I love the way you hum while you work and the way you never waste anything that can be mended or repurposed. I love you for exactly who you are. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. I love you too, she whispered. Jacob reached up to wipe away her tears, his thumb tracing the line of her scar with infinite tenderness. This doesn't define you, he said. It's just part of your story. And I love your whole story, Margaret. Every difficult, beautiful part of it. Spring arrived with a rush of snowmelt and new growth, and with it came Jacob's proposal. He asked her on a Sunday afternoon while they walked along the creek that gave the town its name, the words simple and heartfelt. I want to build a life with you, he said. Here, in Willow Creek, where we both found our home. Margaret's acceptance was equally simple, equally heartfelt. They would marry in the fall, after the harvest when the town could spare time for celebration. The engagement was announced in the church bulletin, and Margaret braced herself for whispers and speculation. But the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. The women whose clothes she had mended and decorated, the customers who had watched her quiet dignity over the months, the townspeople who had come to know her as a neighbor, they welcomed the news with genuine happiness. Mrs. Hutchins insisted on hosting an engagement party, and Margaret found herself in the boarding house parlor surrounded by women who had become, without her quite realizing it, friends. They brought gifts, fabric for her wedding dress, thread in every color, a beautiful thimble that had belonged to someone's grandmother. You've made yourself part of this community, Mrs. Hutchins said as the evening wound down. And we're better for having you. Margaret looked around the room at the faces of women who had accepted her without question, who had supported her business and welcomed her into their lives. She thought of Jacob, probably at home reading by his fireplace, waiting for her. She thought of her cottage, filled with the work she loved and the life she had built. I'm the one who's better for being here, she said. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with the aspens blazing gold on the mountainsides. Margaret wore a dress she had made herself, simple but elegant, with a collar of the finest lace she had ever created. Jacob wore his best suit and the expression of a man who had found everything he had ever wanted. The ceremony was small, held in the church with the whole town in attendance. Margaret's sister had not come, had not even responded to the invitation, but Mrs. Hutchins walked her down the aisle with the pride of a mother, and that was enough. As they exchanged vows, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The rejection, the loneliness, the slow rebuilding of a life she had thought was over. It had all led to this. Jacob's steady voice promising to love and cherish her, her own voice promising the same in return. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the church hall with dancing and cake and the kind of wholehearted celebration that small towns do best. Margaret danced with Jacob, with Mrs. Hutchins, with the children, who had always been fascinated by her sewing machine. As the evening wound down, Jacob took her hand and led her outside. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air, and the town was quiet around them. No regrets? He asked, echoing a question she had once asked herself. Margaret looked at their joined hands, at the simple gold band on her finger, at the man who had seen her not as a ruined woman but as someone worth loving. None, she said firmly, only gratitude. Jacob smiled and kissed her gently. Then let's go home, Mrs. Morrison. Home. The words settled around Margaret like a warm shawl, comfortable and right. She had come to Willow Creek looking for nothing more than survival, and had found instead a place where she could flourish. A community that valued her contributions, work that fulfilled her, and a love that saw her clearly and completely. They walked together through the quiet streets, past the general store where they had first met, past the boarding house where she had begun her new life, to the cottage that was now their home. It was a simple ending to a complicated journey, but sometimes the most profound transformations were the quiet ones. As they reached their front door, Margaret paused to look back at the town that had become her sanctuary. Then she looked at Jacob, at the man who had helped her remember who she had always been beneath the hurt and the fear. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For seeing me, Margaret said. For helping me see myself. Jacob lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. You were always there, Margaret. You just needed the right place to bloom. Inside their cottage, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the evidence of the life they were building together, Margaret Morrison finally understood what it meant to be truly home. Not in a place, but in herself, in the love she had found and the peace she had fought to create. The thread that had begun with rejection and loneliness had woven itself into something beautiful and strong, and like all the best handwork, it was made to last.